Now we will move on to the plenary session 1, Policy Innovation. First, I would like to introduce the moderators for this session, Mr. Tanaka Nobuo and Dr. Ho-Sen Lee. Mr. Tanaka is a chair of the ICEF Steering Committee and former executive director of the International Energy Agency. Dr. Lee is an ICEF Steering Committee member, chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and an endowed chair professor of the Graduate School of Energy and Environment at Korea University. The speakers for this session are Dr. Woo Jianghua, Chief Executive Director of the Beijing Future Innovation Center, Ms. Samantha McCulloch, Head of the Carbon Capture Utilization and Storage Unit of the International Energy Agency, Her Excellency Dr. Patricia Flohr, EU Ambassador to Japan, Dr. Natalie Jones, Research Associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at University of Cambridge, Ms. Tetis Giorgio, Young Ambassador on the Future of Europe, European Youth Parliament, Ms. Kawasaki Rena, Chief Future Officer of Uglena Company Limited. And we'd like to inform you that Ms. Kawasaki has contributed a video message for this session, but will not participate in the discussion. And now I would like to ask Mr. Tanaka to moderate this session. Mr. Tanaka, if you please.
Thank you. This is Nobuo Tanaka, the chairman of the steering committee of ICEF, and I will moderate this session. Welcome everyone to this ICEF 2021. This is 8th ICEF. Yuval Noah Harari, an author of Sapiens, in his recent book, The 21 Lessons, says, nationalism or populism, which is a common feature of the current politics, cannot solve the global problems. The climate change is the one of the 3 global risks for human beings in the 21st century due to him. According to him, to address the global climate challenge, we need politicians, policymakers, business CEOs, and consumers with global identity. ICEF is a forum of innovation experts with this global identity. I hope we can respond to the challenge by Dr. Harari through the international dialogue for beyond zero emission pathways. The 3 plenary sessions of this ICEF will focus 3 major stakeholders of carbon neutral. The first one is policy making, the second is business and finance, and the third is consumers and citizens. And this first session, first plenary, will cover the government policies for innovation. Last year, we focused also on gender. Look at the infographics shown on the slides is the message that we have sent last year. There are many technologies we have to focus: hydrogen, small modular reactor, battery, carbon recycle, SMR, etc. But the players in these infographics are all women. So women's role is definitely very, very important, and there is a strong correlation between climate friendliness and gender balance in corporate decisions and government policy making. Climate change is not gender neutral. The women may suffer more by the climate change, but women can change the policy and business models with their initiatives. We recommended, for example, that TCFD, the Climate Risk Disclosure Forum, should incorporate the gender balance in its disclosure list. And also we urge all the meetings of Beyond Zero Week should have more than about 50-50 gender balance in its composition. And I'm very happy to tell this year in ICEF, we have more than 50% women on the panelists. And this first session is a very unique, that all panelists are women. And this shows that how important their role will be for carbon neutral. Another point I want to mention is that climate change is not generation neutral. Younger generation may suffer more from negative impacts of climate change in the longer term, rather than elder people. This year we invite young people to each panel. We have 2 of them in the first panel. And this women, youth, innovation nexus certainly drive the carbon neutrality. How can we make it happen? This is the hidden agenda of this first plenary session. Let's start it, and I sincerely hope we will have a very interesting but also fun. First, I will ask Ambassador Patricia Flohr of European Commission to make the initial statement. Europe is definitely leading the world by the Green Deal, the green innovation policy for the carbon neutral. And lots of new ideas coming from Europe, and I really ask Ambassador Flohr to give us the European innovative policies for the Green Deal. Ambassador, you have the floor.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, and of course also the moderator, Mr. Tanaka, for his kind invitation to speak on this occasion. My first key message to everyone is today, there's no planet B. We need courageous and innovative action, and we need it now in order to save our planet. And it's also true that the EU and Japan and everyone else should work together to make this happen. Now, how does the EU respond to this global call, which is, of course, enshrined in the Paris Agreement? With ambitious goals and innovative practical measures to ensure that we can meet our targets. The EU Green Deal, already mentioned, was adopted in 2019 as the new EU growth strategy. So it's a commitment to ensure economic growth, also new jobs, but at the same time cut emissions and advance. Our commitment is climate neutrality by 2050, and it's at the very heart of the European Green Deal. It was enshrined in the first ever EU climate law this year. As a global climate leader, the EU was also true to our pledge to raise our ambitions in order to fill the Paris Agreement ahead of the COP26 summit. We set a new medium-term objective. We want to reduce our emissions by 55% by 2030. And that remains unchanged despite Corona, despite the economic crisis related to it. The EU is not alone in this ambition. The G7 have also agreed that they all need to take the same steps. They've committed to zero emissions too. And also the EU and Japan have concluded a green alliance in May during our summit in order to accelerate the transition of our economies and societies. The challenge, how to translate these commitments into concrete action. So we need new legal frameworks, we need to enhance our tools such as emissions trading and tax schemes. This is the purpose of the so-called Fit for 55 package that the European Commission presented in July. And it's one of the most ambitious overhauls of climate policy in EU history. It contains 12 legislative proposals. So let me just mention a few. We put more ambitious targets on the share of renewable energy in the European energy mix. We want to get to 40% of renewables by 2030. We will also extend the European emissions trading scheme to transport, including aviation and shipping, and to buildings as of 2025. The new European Energy Taxation Directive will also be amended to shift tax incentives away from fossil fuels. There is also a proposal watched globally to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically means that we want to prevent carbon leakage, so we have to put a carbon price on imports of selected products. All of these proposals are now with the European Council, the member states, and with the European Parliament, and they will be debated as we speak. Let me highlight one other element of our measures, very important for youth, women, for everyone. We want a just transition. So we need to make sure that this transition towards a climate-neutral economy is happening in a fair way. No one must be left behind, at home and also globally. We've introduced a just transition mechanism aiming to mobilize at least 150 billion euros to support our member states, regions, companies, and workers. My second message today: the global scientific community needs to unite around finding innovative solutions for addressing climate challenges. The EU will promote this under our Horizon Europe program. Horizon Europe is the new EU framework for research and innovation, and it has an unprecedented budget of 95.5 billion euros until 2027. And 35% of that, so 33.4 billion of this program on research and innovation, will go to climate objectives. Let me say, it's not only about Europe. We need a global science for a green future. For the first time, the EU will open association to our Horizon Europe program to third countries. So I would invite Japan to also consider association. It would allow Japanese researchers to become automatically eligible for funding from Horizon Europe. Cooperation on research and innovation is one of the areas where the EU and Japan should really work together under the Green Alliance. And we have been collaborating in the past under Horizon 2020. And let me name a few areas where research has been intensified: advanced biofuels and alternative renewable fuels. So aviation fuel, or also alternative fuel for storage, transport, and utilization of renewable energies, of course. And the EU and Japan Science and Technology Agency have decided to jointly provide funding for that. Innovative research requires solid data, and therefore we cooperate with others on Earth observation, including under our Copernicus program, also on changes in the Arctic. My third message for today is that all stakeholders should come together in partnerships to combat climate change. Long-ship partnerships with industry will be particularly instrumental and central in achieving carbon neutrality. So we create European partnerships, which are initiatives where the EU, national authorities, and the private sector join in supporting a program of research and innovation activities. By bringing private and public partners together, we help in making the investments more efficient. We reduce the fragmentation of the research and innovation landscape. Partners can come from industry, universities, research, public service, civil society organizations, NGOs. A key characteristic in the spirit of open science of these partnerships is that the results of the projects are publicly available. So the European Partnership on Clean Hydrogen is a perfect example, And the partnerships cover also clean aviation, automated driving, the battery value chains, and so forth. In conclusion, the latest report of the IPCC leaves no doubt. We have to act now and take determined action. There's no time to lose. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Flo. Yeah, you mentioned about the clean hydrogen in a part of your speech. Yes, Japan has, in a way, led the hydrogen economy since 2014, when the fuel cell vehicle Mirai had started running. Mm-hmm. And we did the strategy in 2017, so Japan was the leader. But at this moment, I think Europe, and especially China, overtook us. And now the leader of hydrogen is Europe. Why Europe took this hydrogen as a major part of your strategy? And what is behind this hydrogen, clean hydrogen strategy?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, of course, hydrogen is a zero-emission fuel, a zero-emission energy source. And that is what we are looking for. We want to reduce emissions by 2050 to zero. We want to become climate neutral. So therefore, hydrogen will be a good component of our strategy. But let me emphasize that not all hydrogen is the same. You've said it yourself. So the EU certainly will be looking for green hydrogen. Or put differently, if you produce hydrogen with coal, brown hydrogen, this will not help our climate on this planet. So therefore, yes, hydrogen is a very important part of the European strategy, clean, green hydrogen.
Thank you. Yeah, Japan is pushing clean, and blue is fine with us, whatever we say. Let's say brown may have a problem, but blue hydrogen with CCS from natural gas is probably necessary, let's say, hydrogen, and together with the green hydrogen from renewables. But let's move to the next speaker, Wu Changwa. Wu-san, China is a major player, and China is most important to reduce carbon dioxide, and China has already committed the carbon neutral by 2060. So how can China really achieve this? This is a really very tough and demanding situation for China. Wu-san, you have a floor.
Thank you, Tanaka. I think I have a video or
yes.
something like that.
Yes, we will have the video recording statement of yours. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Changhua Wu, China Director, Office of German Working, and the CEO of Beijing Future Innovation Center. It is my great honor and privilege to join the Policy Innovation Panel. A new age has dawned again. It is defined by new prominent characteristics: cascading crisis, accelerated mass extinction, adaptivity and resilience, pivotal and reset. And very importantly, it's represented by a collective species-level reckoning and action towards carbon neutrality by mid-century. China and Chinese people have made the commitment of capping emissions before 2030 and then achieving carbon neutrality before 2060. This is not only aligned with the Paris Agreement target, but also perfectly aligned with the global shared and common aspiration and the destination to accelerate a transition towards a clean, smart, and net zero carbon future. And yet, China accounts for about 1/3 of global emissions, with its energy today still heavily relying on coal. To a certain extent, China holds a key of make it or break it for humanity collectively to succeed in tackling the global warming challenge. 1 year apart since the Chinese president announced this 2030-2060 dual target at the UN conference last year, the clarity and the certainty of policy direction has triggered a nationwide frenzy to race to carbon neutrality. While some leading companies and regions have announced their own carbon neutrality targets, some other regions geared up their rush to raise emissions, naively thinking that they would enjoy more quota of emissions when caps are set. The stock markets reacted in favor of those companies, clearly linked with such a clean energy revolution, while new VC and PE funds are set up in the name of carbon neutrality to invest in emerging technologies and innovation, and the National Electricity Sector Carbon Trading Scheme has been up and running since early July, with a floating trading price at around $8 per ton. And academics and think tanks keeping releasing their modeling work of the pathways for the country to achieving the set targets, while individual consumers are joining forces to champion low carbon transportation and changing consumption behaviors. And in the middle of all this came an unexpected China blackout. About 20 provinces have to opt a rationing scheme of electricity supply, in particular for industrial facilities and in some cases for residential energy consumption as well. A real-life living case to showcase the disconnects among crucial pieces of the puzzle. It also offers a chance and a new perspective in the last mile space to understand what holds back the acceleration of scaling clean energy solution and rethinking policy innovation in the new context of the age of resilience in order to deliver a successful transition towards carbon neutrality. Let me highlight two linked dimensions to illustrate why connecting the dots has become so critical and how complex the landscape has become. First is China's curse of coal. 56% of China's electricity today is generated from coal, down from more than 70% a decade ago. Very impressive progress. Such an achievement is driven largely by national policy goals to control and reduce total energy consumption, in particular coal, energy intensity target, as well as carbon intensity target. Electricity market is a system that holds all pieces together and connects many dots, from fuels to power generation to grids that dispatches and transmits electricity, and then to end users. The curse occurred when sudden rise of electricity demand came due to overshooting supply chain demand for Chinese manufacturing capability due to the pandemic disruption and then the extreme heat in the summer in many parts of the country, which led to demand for powering cooling. Thus, such rising demand overwhelms the energy and carbon control policy goals. At the end, it is a supply chain challenge, inadequate supply of coal. It is a value chain challenge constrained by lacking power sector reform and demonstrated in mismatching pricing mechanisms that fail to reflect real costs. It's a geopolitical miscalculation, in particularly disrupting coal import from Australia. And it could also be regarded as a necessary chaos to get all things in order before embarking on the country's second decade of decarbonization, a most decisive one to decode the curse of coal. And then let's take a look at the second dimension. I call it China's gospel of clean energy revolution. China's contribution to accelerating global clean energy transition is a case made and undoubtable. And the already built up manufacturing capabilities and supply chains is a reflection of such a contribution. From solar and wind energy to batteries and materials, China is well positioned to continue to play her dual role in the transition and innovation. Achieving net zero goal requires global deployment of best manufacturing capabilities. It calls for accelerated innovation in technology, costing and pricing, regulation and business model, and the business model innovation is required in order to efficiently deploy Chinese manufacturing capabilities in solar, wind, batteries, and other carbon reduction technologies. At the foundation of this gospel is investing in new infrastructure to enable the accelerated transition. The convergence of three internets, communication internets, clean energy internet, and transportation and mobility internets form the foundation to enable transformation. These three internets are continuously being fed data from sensors embedded across society that are monitoring activity of all kinds in real life, from ecosystems, agricultural fields, warehouses, road systems, factory production lines, retail stores, and especially from residential, commercial, and institutional building stock, allowing humanity to more efficiently manage power and move day-to-day economic activity and social life from where they work and live. A united human front is to achieve carbon neutrality, empowered by emerging technologies and investment, enabled by infrastructure transformation. We are destined to win this war against ourselves. A most inspiring sign of hope is a rising younger generation, millennials and Gen Zs, who are spearheading a planetary mobilization in support of global Green New Deal to save life on Earth, and is setting the agenda for a bold political movement with the potential to revolutionize society. They represent the rising biosphere consciousness. They advocate people and the planet positive, an aligned and a common purpose of human development measured by two interconnected fundamental indicators, planetary boundary and the people's well-being. And they not only demand change, but also take actions to become part of the solution. This is where our hope lies. We share a common destiny, and together we can cool down the warming planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Usam. Very, very fascinating statement of yours about explaining China and the hope for the climate mitigation, change mitigation. In your statement, you mentioned about the curse of coal. Certainly, that is a major issue for China to achieve decarbonization. Is the IEA, recently IEA made a report, roadmap for China for decarbonization, and even they say this the Chinese targets of peaking out the CO2 emission by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2060 could be accelerated. Even a couple of years earlier, the achievement is possible. But as you say, this curse of coal is the thing to overcome. How do you think it's possible to solve the reliance of coal to be reduced significantly in the near future?
Thank you, Tanaka-san. I think the picture is clear. Even though it's a China challenge, it's definitely a global challenge, and China has a lot of coal. And as I mentioned in my speech, so today is 56% for electricity. The plan is definitely to reduce dramatically. So there are a few solutions already sort of in progress. One is efficiency, and you could tell energy efficiency has been and will continue to be a major national agenda. And of course, the second solution is switch, right? We need to switch to alternative fuels, renewable energy, wind and solar, but China is also very heavy on nuclear as well, besides the solutions like electrification, hydrogen, among others. So yes, coal probably will continue to be part of the energy landscape leading up even to mid of century, but somehow in order to tackle climate change, China has to somehow dramatically reduce coal consumption as soon as possible. In terms of peaking, I think there were two, this is what we call like dual targets. So currently commitment is before 2030. Of course, there are many scenarios flying around, looking into say how early China will be to achieve those goals. So yes, 2025 probably is something more realistic. And there are even some academic researchers looking into 2022. So we'll see. But currently, the energy crisis in China now, which particularly this year, the coal consumption is definitely going to be dramatically increased. I think some numbers say probably by 20% increase this year. That's going to definitely distort the picture very short term in the next couple of years. Hopefully, somehow, we'll be able to learn from the lessons and really to correct the policy design thinking not only connecting the dots, but really addressing the social, political, and also geopolitical, elements, so that we'll be able, or at least for China, actually support China to accelerate its pathway out of coal and moving towards a clean energy future, so that we'll be able to address the global climate change challenges. I said this is a 10 billion ton challenge, not only for China, but for global community to figure out how to address that as soon as possible.
Thank you. Let's move to Samantha McLough from IEA. Welcome back, Samantha. I think IEA is always the focal point of everybody after the net zero by 2050 roadmap. And sometimes the oil producing or gas producing companies are very critical about your report and calling it IEA shock. And IEA was created by oil shock, but now you are creating shock to the oil companies, countries. This is very interesting. Change trading places of, let's say, crisis makers. But anyway, I'll give the floor to Samantha, and you will have also the recording of the statement. Please go ahead.
Good morning, my name is Samantha McCulloch. I'm the head of the CCUS team here at the International Energy Agency, and it's really such a pleasure to be able to join the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum again this year. So in the next few moments, I'd like to share some insights from the IEA on achieving net zero goals globally, particularly with a focus on innovation and carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies. So in May this year, the IEA released a flagship report providing a roadmap for the global energy sector to reach net zero emissions. This report really responds to the growing momentum behind pledges to achieve net zero, many by mid-century, although some countries aim to achieve this target earlier, some a bit later. Our report includes more than 400 milestones for innovation, for technology deployment, and for policy. It covers a full suite of technologies and measures on both the supply and the demand sides. So jumping straight in to look at what needs to happen to be on track for net zero emissions in 2050. Well, from today, we need to cut CO2 emissions by around 13 gigatons or billion tons by 2030. Unfortunately, most of the technologies needed to do this are available and cost effective already. But to give some examples of what would need to happen, well, annual capacity additions of solar PV and wind quadrupled over the past decade, but they need to quadruple again this decade in the net zero scenario. This means that by 2030, annual solar PV and wind capacity additions are more than 1,000 gigawatts. This is compared to around 250 gigawatts today. Wind and solar PV provide as much as 40% of electricity generation globally in 2030, and that's up from around 9% today. Electric car sales must rise 18-fold. So in 2020, around 5% of car sales were electric, but by 2030, this needs to be about 60%. From 2035, globally, there are no new sales of internal combustion engine cars. And boosting energy efficiency is also key. So many efficiency measures in industry, buildings, appliances, and transport can be put into effect and scaled up very quickly. And that's what we see happening in the net zero pathway. As a result, the energy intensity of the global economy falls by 4% a year. So in recent years, energy intensity has fallen by less than 2%. So as mentioned earlier, we basically have all of the technologies available in the market today to achieve the emissions reductions required to 2030. But a full transition to net zero emissions by 2050 will require more than that. It will require tackling emissions in sectors such as long distance transport and heavy industries. And while we know the kinds of technologies that can help achieve the full decarbonisation of these sectors, we don't yet have them in the market. So many are today still at the demonstration or even the prototype stage. There are many technology options that can help decarbonising these sectors, covering options such as electrification, carbon capture, hydrogen and bioenergy. In 2050, almost 50% of CO2 emissions reductions in the net zero pathway come from such technologies that are currently not yet available in the market. So the 2020s needs to be the decade of really rolling out technologies in the market and innovation to get all of these new technologies to the market. Moving now to look particularly at CCUS. CCUS plays an important and varied role in a net zero pathway. CCUS can address emissions from existing energy infrastructure, really recognising that many of today's power and industrial facilities have only recently been built and could have technical lives that extend to 2050 and even beyond. CCUS is one of few solutions that we have for heavy industry. It can provide a platform to cost-effectively scale up the availability of low-carbon hydrogen and ammonia, and it also underpins technology-based approaches for carbon removal. So an immediate acceleration in the rollout of projects is needed now to reach almost 1.7 billion tonnes of CO2 being captured by 2030. This is from around just over 40 million tonnes today. So in the period to 2030, around 70% of the growth in CCUS comes from low-carbon hydrogen production, from heavy industries, and also retrofits in the power sector. After 2030, more than 1/3 of the growth in CO2 capture is in heavy industry. So here you can see that in the growing share in the yellow, which includes both process emissions and also fuel combustion. Over the period to 2050, we see a growing role for carbon removal technologies. So in particular, bioenergy with CCUS and also direct air capture. So we have around 2.4 billion tonnes of CO2 captured from these approaches in 2050. Most of this is for carbon removal, so around 1.9 gigatons or billion tonnes of capture is ultimately destined for permanent storage to provide carbon removal, but also around 500 million tonnes of CO2 is used to produce synthetic aviation fuels, recognising that this is another sector with few alternatives for decarbonisation. So achieving this level of deployment will require a major boost in innovation and in policy support for CCUS. So the good news is that we are currently seeing really unprecedented momentum for CCUS. This is underpinned by net zero targets and an improved investment environment, but there's been a great deal of recent project activity. So I'll look forward to discussing these and other issues during the panel. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Samantha. You focus about CCS, as CCUS is a very important technology to make carbon neutral. And but in a way, IEA's estimate of carbon, sequestrated by 2050 is somewhat like 7 gigaton. And I think it is a bit modest compared to the other prospect or forecast. And do you know that ICEF last year focused biomass carbon removal and storage? We call it bikers. It is not BECS, not burning the biomass to reduce carbon dioxide and CCS capture the CO2 underground. So we think this is much more efficient than the traditional BECS. And also this year, we focus about the carbon mineralization, enhancing carbon mineralization. What do you think about these technologies as a part of CCUS? What is your IEA's assessment of these new CCUS technologies?
Thank you, Tanaka-san. And indeed, I think ICEF has delivered some really excellent reports related to CCUS technologies in recent years.
Thank you.
Indeed, with our deployment of CCUS, I wanted to highlight your comment just now about that it's relatively conservative, I think, relative to scenarios that have been considered by the IPCC. But of course, as you saw in my slides, there is still a very, very significant scale up from around 40 million tonnes being captured today to more than 7 billion tonnes in 2050. So this is still a significant task ahead and a significant challenge ahead. Within the CCUS space, of course, we're talking about a full suite of technologies with various applications. We absolutely see a role for bioenergy with CCUS applications. We do see a role for mineralization, although ultimately we see geological storage as being really doing the bulk of the storage task. And so that has also been a focus of our work in terms of underscoring the need to really identify, assess and characterize and make storage available to be able to underpin the deployment of CCUS at this kind of scale going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for taking note of what we have recommended already. Let's move to Natalie Jones. Dr. Jones, can you give us your insight about the policies for climate mitigation? Floor is yours.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm Natalie Jones from the University of Cambridge, and I'm talking to you today about public investment and coordinated industrial policy. Now, we know we need concrete plans for rapid emissions reduction, and for this we need policies for innovation as well as innovative policy making. Now, public investment and industrial policy, if done right, can not only speed the transformation to decarbonising the economy, but can also provide good quality green jobs and can help combat poverty and inequality. So it's about combating the climate crisis, which as we all know is urgent, but we can also do this in a way which helps us meet other societal objectives. These kinds of approaches are sometimes known as the Green New Deal. This is of course a Western term harking back to the post-depression policies of the 1930s in the United States. However, regardless of what you call it, it is a much more globally applicable policy approach. And for example, the Republic of Korea has recently adopted a Green New Deal. Now, let me lay out a few key planks of this approach. Now, a key part, of course, is policies to stimulate technological innovation. However, this is about much more than technology. The first plank is large-scale public investment, and this is what we might know as industrial policy per se. We also have ownership, universal basic services, job guarantees, global investment and support, and stopping investment in problem sectors. Now, I will go through what each of these mean in turn and give some examples as well. So the first of the planks, as I mentioned, is industrial policy. So this is targeted government support for specific industries to build low carbon parts of the economy. This means, firstly, of course, investments in technological solutions, particularly for hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, shipping, and so on. It also importantly means investment in infrastructure. This might include energy infrastructure like electric vehicle chargers, transmission lines, as well as public transport, decarbonising buildings, constructing low-cost, low-carbon houses, improving resilience. And for some countries as well, this means government procurement to boost domestic manufacturing. One example is the Green New Deal in the Republic of Korea, which has committed trillions to renewable energy infrastructure, insulating public buildings, establishing a smart grid, and large-scale research and development and demonstration projects for clean energy. Another example is the infrastructure bill, which was recently passed in the United States Senate and will be voted on in the House on Friday. This contains major spending on rail, broadband infrastructure, water infrastructure, public transport, resilience, electric vehicle infrastructure, and other things as well. So we can see that this is an approach which is already being widely taken across the world. Now, the second plank, which is related with investment, is ownership. So it's important to reflect on the fact that many investments in a low carbon future will bring returns over much longer timeframes than markets usually expect. So this means that in addition to the private sector, there is a much greater role for public sector investment and asset ownership because its rates of return are typically lower than commercial rates of return. An additional consideration here is that public ownership of essential infrastructures can lead to more democratic control over the economy. So in a lot of countries around the world where over the last number of decades industries have been privatized, we have been seeing proposals and moves towards renewed democratic ownership of essential infrastructure, like energy, like housing, for example. Now, the next plank is universal basic services, and this goes quite well with ownership and investment, because this is basically about ensuring that people can live a flourishing life without necessarily needing a high income. So universal basic services is the idea that there could be a wider range of free public services, including housing, healthcare, water, electricity, public transport, and so on. And the idea behind this is that public services have a lower environmental impact than their private equivalents. This is in part because reducing dependence on individual consumer goods mitigates the competition for social status and as a consequence counteracts consumerism. And it's also worth noting that more equal societies tend to have lower levels of average emissions per capita. A final crucially interlinked policy is a green jobs guarantee. Now, this would give a low carbon job to anyone wanting one, which would help to tackle youth unemployment. Importantly, green jobs are not only jobs in, for example, construction, solar energy, retrofitting buildings, or habitat restoration. Rather, as various policy experts have argued, we can actually recategorize care jobs like nursing, teaching, and social care as green jobs, because these jobs are low carbon by nature. They involve caring for people and for planet, and because they are jobs that more often, at least in a lot of countries, employ women, there is an important gender equality element here. And workers in carbon-intensive, polluting industries ought to be retrained to find new job opportunities in clean sectors. An example here is the Civilian Climate Corps proposal in the US. This would put underemployed Americans to work on projects to conserve and restore public lands and waters, increase reforestation, protect biodiversity, and so on. And an important thing to note is global investment and support, because you can say, well, it's all very well for countries who have the capability, but what about the countries lacking fiscal space who can't make these kinds of public investments? So it's important to think about how we can reform global investment and trade regimes to promote more sustainable and democratic economies worldwide. And finally, a corollary of the investment approach I've been talking about is actually stopping investment in sectors which cause problems. And we know from the International Energy Agency report earlier this year that there is no room for new coal, oil, and gas infrastructure. So what we can do here is stop subsidizing fossil fuels, stop publicly financing coal, oil, and gas, and also stop new licensing of coal, oil, and gas. With that, I will end here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Natalie. Very, very interesting analysis about the policies toward carbon neutral. In fact, I'm very much interested hearing that you say the industrial policy is very important for carbon neutral. when I was in the Washington, D.C. as a government official, diplomats from the METI, the big discussion is the industrial policy was bad thing. Don't intervene to the market. Just leave the market to decide which industry will win, which technology will win. So targeting is the worst word from the discussion with US government at the time. Now things is very different. To make the carbon neutral happens, the government intervention, you call it industrial policy, is necessary. So this change is dramatic for me, and so maybe the purpose legitimize the means or tools, but you think there's a big change in the way we think about the government policy, or but climate change is exception. What do you think, Natalie?
So I think it's a very interesting point, and you're completely right. Industrial policy has been seen as a bad thing, as almost a taboo. But what we have seen is an increasing realization that the kind of completely unregulated markets have actually been a cause of the crisis as well. And we've seen that actually there's been a realization that as well, there's no such thing as a completely unregulated market. There has always been a state involvement in technology innovation. There's a really excellent book by Mariana Mazzucato on this topic, Mission Economy. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This has been a big change, and I think it's a necessary one because we're moving past the phase of, complete leave the market to do its own thing, and it's realizing that the state actually does have a role alongside the market.
Thank you, Natalie. Let's move to Tedis Georgiou. I think you are the member of the European Youth Parliament, and please share with us about your experience. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here representing the European Youth Parliament, so thank you very much for having me. Please start the presentation. Next slide, please. So what is the European Youth Parliament? Next slide, please. The European Youth Parliament is a peer-to-peer educational program that empowers young people from across Europe to be open-minded, active citizens. We provide participants with a forum to develop and express their opinions by bringing young people from different backgrounds together. The European Youth Parliament promotes intercultural dialogue and exchange. Next, please. We have 30,000 annual participants in our events from 40 European countries. Currently, there are 3,500 active volunteers who are dedicated to UAP's mission and keep actively giving back through continuing to organize events. Moreover, we have 1,500 schools currently involved in UAP. Next, please. More than 500 events are organized by the European Youth Parliament volunteers on an annual basis across Europe. This is very important to us, as not only are our volunteers passionate and inspired to continue organizing and attending events, but also we get to spread our mission of inspiring and empowering young people. Next slide, please. The European Youth Parliament is a completely youth-led network of independent organizations from 40 European countries. This is part of why our organization is so special. The European Youth Parliament is completely youth-led from its international governance structures until the organization of local events. The standardized format of the European Youth Parliament's events follows a parliamentary session format. Young people in such events work in international groups and try to solve relevant European problems by working out their proposed solutions. In the European Youth Parliament, we focus on team building, where we place emphasis on a positive participant experience, as well as for the participants to feel comfortable with each other before starting difficult discussions. This is part of why our volunteers stay engaged and continue attending events, leading to a network that has been active for 35 years. Next, please. One of our most important projects regarding climate and energy is the Power Shifts project that took place between 2015 and 2021. By taking part in the project's activities, participants learn ways of engaging and fostering the debate of energy in their communities, starting from a local up to the European level. Next, please. The event has reached 4,000 participants across Europe through 28 international, national, and regional events. 4 innovation labs happened, allowing for an exchange of innovative ideas and practices regarding energy issues. Moreover, 2 position papers were produced in the frame of this project. Next slide. I will now be introducing you an ongoing project at the European Youth Parliament, which is called Young Opinions on the Future of Europe. Next slide, please. The European Youth Parliament has become a recipient of the European Parliament Grant on Youth Engagement for the Conference on the Future of Europe. The general objective of this project is to amplify youth voices and opinions on the future of Europe, as well as to structurally connect young European citizens by engaging them with the upcoming Conference on the Future of Europe. The European Youth Parliament events held within the framework of this project allow the youth to directly engage with topics relevant to the Conference on the Future of Europe. Next to these events, youth ideas and opinions are being collected in the frame of Youth Poll on the Future of Europe of thousands of young people across Europe. Next, please. For this project, there are 25 young ambassadors on the Future of Europe. 10 engagement EYP events across Europe are happening within the framework of this project, while 1,500 young people are currently involved in the discussions, with more than 1,000 people having took part in the youth poll. All of this led to one Future of Europe vision paper, which includes different topics relating to the upcoming Conference on the Future of Europe, with the youth's vision for these topics, as well as some policy recommendations. The role of the young ambassadors includes summarizing and structuring the outputs of the youth poll, as well as the output of previous EYP events with topics related to different topics. Young ambassadors are focusing on different topics, one of them being the global climate crisis, and I will proceed to present to you the main positions of young people in the European Youth Parliament regarding their vision and policy recommendations relevant to climate and energy, which provide a general vision for what young people want to see in policies. Next slide, please. Next, please. Firstly, an overwhelming majority of participants demands a 100% transition of our energy systems to renewable energy. Moreover, they call for infrastructure and transportation systems that allow for sufficient travel, as they do not feel like the existing ones align with a sustainable future or allow them to make sustainable choices. Young people care about sufficient support to communities that are most affected by the climate crisis and call for mitigation, adaptation, and recovery mechanisms. At the same time, they wish to ensure the stability and growth of affected communities whose cultures and economies heavily rely on fossil fuels. This includes protecting workers, particularly in the coal industry, who are at risk of unemployment as part of the transition to cleaner energy. Moreover, they acknowledge that the climate crisis can only be resolved through a global perspective. Climate change should be enshrined as a priority in all components of European foreign policy, while countries outside the EU should also be held accountable to their climate goals and to the EU's climate goals. They are also well aware of the migration crisis that is expected to arise due to the climate change's negative impacts and call for their inclusion in the larger reform of policies regarding migration. Next slide, please. They also acknowledge that there is a need to fully align economic instruments with climate priorities in order to foster a green circular economy. With this being said, investments in fossil fuel infrastructure should be terminated immediately. Young people wish to fully incorporate agriculture and food systems into the European Green Deal, including a thorough reform of the common agricultural policies, as food production should be more environmentally friendly in all its stages. Next slide, please. The youth wishes for stronger measures for environmental protection to safeguard biodiversity and ensure the sustainable use of land, waters, and resources. Lastly, the youth considers it necessary to reform European governance structures to provide a sound legal framework for effectively addressing the ongoing climate crisis. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Tetis. My question to you is that maybe it's better to ask the question to Ambassador Flo, but in Europe, the Green Party is very strong, and especially in Germany, but in any other places. So Green Party is certainly supporting this energy transition or climate change mitigation or decarbonization. And the strength of Green Party is the major or vast support by the young people to the Green Party. Is this the case?
Exactly. Young people are very much passionate about issues, which you can see from the participation of many young people in the European Youth Parliament and other similar projects. We see that they are committed to ensure a greener future for themselves and for the future generations. And in EYP, we see a very big passion from them, because even though they're young and the topics are very technical and difficult at times, they're very inspired and passionate to contribute in the best way that they can.
Thank you. Let's get the statement from Rena Kawasaki. She is the Chief Future Officer of the Ugrena company, the very famous bio company of Japan. She's 16 years old, and she is in the art class of the senior high school, so she cannot come, but she gave us the recorded message. So let's listen to the Japanese young person here.
Hi, my name is Rena Kawasaki. I'm 16 years old. I'm in the 11th grade, and I'm the current CFO for Ugrena Ltd. In order to develop education considering sustainability, there has to be a clear connection between the curriculum and the actions that youth can take and clearly see change in the society. I've had many youth tell me that they got interest in the area of SDGs and sustainability in school, which I'm incredibly empowered and hopeful for. However, most of the current educational system is a curriculum for the sole sake of a curriculum and has no indication for an outlet of change for youth to use the knowledge they have gained in school. I believe that in order for major advancements to be made, we have to step out of the constrictions and stop following tradition, to stop drawing the line between school education and real life. All education, and especially education considering sustainability, has to continue outside of school. I'm the current CFO for Ugrena Ltd, and there are a couple of things that I have learned by taking on this role and seeing the two perspectives from a company and from a youth. First, you must understand how powerless many of us youth feel compared to youth, corporations, and governments. We have never seen any of our ideas or opinions represented in media, in politics, even in company messaging, and we feel that our opinions don't matter. The only thing I will ask for you is to be open, to be accepting, to reach out to us. Please use your power and please become the platform, the outlet of change, the extension of our education. Us youth just need a platform, just the knowledge that we can trust adults and that adults trust us. Just this simple change of mindset and the action of reaching out and willing to just listen has made a great change for so many youth and their lives, as it did with my involvement with Ugrena. So please just remember, we youth are not asking for anything out of the ordinary, just the trust and the knowledge that corporations and governments trust us enough to lend their platform to us youth. It makes all the difference. Let me first state the obvious. Environmental issues are global issues that are intertwined in its origins with solutions with issues such as poverty, education, and more. So far, although the situation has gradually become better over the years, these supposed global issues were spoken and discussed by an overwhelmingly outspoken majority that has left the space to debate a global issue to be confined, causing proposed solutions only to be reflected of that outspoken majority. Now I, a youth, a female raised in a non-traditional school in Japan, has come to the point where I am able to speak with you all about this confined topic that was once discussed only by a certain group of people. We are way behind in that we are still considering the inclusion of minority groups just to make up the diversity factor of these discussions. I can guarantee that the much needed and overdue inclusion of youth and other silenced minorities in these crucial discussions will lead to the never before seen innovations and advancements of solutions in the realms of environmental issues. With the inclusion of long oppressed opinions and representation of identities, I can clearly see a future where every person of any age, of any sexual orientation, of any ethnic background, to be proudly represented and proudly outspoken, regardless of their position in society, to and within the solution of these issues, from casual conversations to international debates.
Wow. Well, she's just like Greta Thunberg of Japan, yeah. This is very, very interesting, very strong message. Trust and the voices must be heard. I respect the president of the Ukraine. He's my good friend, Mr. Izumo. He started this idea of chief future officer to the company, and picking up very young people and listen to their views is a very, very interesting way to accommodate their ideas to the business. But also government must listen. Ambassador Flo, how have you heard about Greta, Rena Kawasaki or Tetis, their views to you?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think in Europe, the youth and young people already play a huge role. I mean, we see Fridays for Futures. We see how young people take to the streets and really demand that their voices are heard. And for very good reason, because the resources which we squander and the climate change which we do nothing against, it will be the heritage. They will inherit it, and so they will be actually also the victims of it. And so therefore they have a right to be involved in policy making and to be heard. I also would actually look towards young people, because a lot of what needs to be done will go beyond government policies. It will mean changing our own behavior. Different consumption, changing how we work, actually how we move, mobility. So therefore, these patterns of behavior changes also, of course, can be brought forward by young people. And I see that many already do this. So they don't have their own car, they do car sharing. They become vegetarians, many things that I could actually say in that regard. So I think this is very important. And Thetis, thank you for introducing the European Youth Parliament, because again, gender mainstreaming, youth mainstreaming, it means bringing your points of view into policy making, in making sure that we actually agree on the right policies, which would ensure that no one is left behind, that the young people have the best opportunity for creating and shaping their own lives.
Thank you. By the way, there is a very interesting question from the audience. Maybe this is a good question to Ambassador Flora also. What do you think about making hydrogen from the nuclear energy? I think you are from Germany, so we know the policy of Germany to the nuclear power, but hydrogen from the nuclear power can be considered as green?
Well, in principle, of course, it's a different case from the coal case, which obviously hydrogen could not be considered green. Now, therefore, of course, nuclear not producing direct emissions is a different case. On nuclear, of course, as you know, in societies, there are very different opinions. There's no actually EU position, because member states have different approaches to nuclear. And so in Germany, after Fukushima 10 years ago, the German government opted to end nuclear energy in Germany. France is very different. So there's no unified opinion of that. So therefore, it's also a very difficult topic, of course, here in Japan, I understand. So that's for society to decide. But in principle, anything that could produce hydrogen without causing emissions would of course then count as green or clean hydrogen from my point of view.
Thank you. Yeah, well, in the ICEF, we have the nuclear session tomorrow, and certainly one of the issues is hydrogen could be the good products of the nuclear. Especially Japan is aiming at the high temperature gas reactor, and that is another way of using small reactors in a flexible way to contribute to the carbon neutrality. Of course, the Prime Minister's, President of Liberal Democratic Party has been under the big discussion of the nuclear power. The candidate, Mr. Cornell, was somewhat against the nuclear power, especially recycle. So we need to discuss the future of the nuclear much more seriously, and what kind of role it can play in carbon neutrality is certainly one of the very important agenda for ICEF. And for that, I think women's role for the nuclear power is also very, very important in my view. By the way, let's move to the question to Wu Changhua. Changhua, I think Ambassador Flora mentioned about lots of innovation for the policy for the European Union. Talk about not only the innovation itself, but to change the policy framework is very important for carbon neutrality. She mentioned about just transition, carbon border adjustment measures, tax issues, ETS, and the carbon pricing. So these are the, let's say, kind of innovation for the policy by the European Union. How China respond to this kind of policy innovation to achieve carbon neutrality?
Sure, thank you. Interesting enough, sometimes, as you know, in the policy advisory community, we joke about it. Any new innovation around the policy tools, the instruments, somehow being deployed somewhere outside China, very quickly you're going to find that in China. In particular, if you look at China's carbon market, literally in the last decade or so, we literally copied EU ETS. Right, and there are many, many good practices, best practices that China is desperately looking for because we cannot wait, right? We cannot just rely on ourselves and learn gradually, slowly. Rather, we need to learn quickly and from others there. So China's policy, back to the specific targets, actually, we have 2030, 2060 targets there. This is not totally new in a way in terms of efforts. If you look at, I think the way to look at China's policy landscape actually to drive the carbon now capping and the neutrality goals, one, of course, we need to address coal. This is partly driven by, carbon, but also air pollution there as well. So coal in the last decade or so has been a major target. Of course, one, we've been reducing reliance on coal. The numbers definitely tell you. And secondly, we set the targets around, we need to reduce emissions of total energy, particular coal. The numbers tell you this as well. Intensity targets has been there for more than a decade. Chinese government officially submitted to the Copenhagen process, actually, carbon intensity targets, set very specific quantitative targets around the energy intensity and carbon. So we've been sort of capping, trying to control, the use and shrink that as much as possible. But in the meantime, of course, we need to, as I said, the efficiency, the intensity is important, but also alternatives. So China has been, I think early on you asked a question about the industrial policy. China has been literally campaigning, the government-driven industrial policies there. Without the national government public funding policy incentives, for industrial policy, there's no way China would have got, where we are today. If you look at the renewable, solar, wind, and now batteries, shifting actually the whole industrial landscape towards, aligned with the carbon neutrality is there. Now, China is also recognizing, of course, following very closely the EU, particularly around the cross-border carbon tax issues there. So pricing carbon definitely has been a very important tool, and China, as a big player in the globalization process, particularly from trade and investment perspective, has to somehow at least in sync, right? So pricing carbon is already happening in China. Carbon market and not only focusing on electricity market sector, but more will be included and literally following the footsteps of the EU. So hopefully somehow, rather than creating more frictions, because we each of us have been creating different policies, bars or whatever, causing frictions. Rather, we need to align actually with each other. I think there are a lot of details, discussions, even negotiations need to happen, particularly between EU and China around the new rules around the investment and the trade, particularly around the carbon. Now carbon neutrality goes there. There's a lot of work that needs to happen, but somehow China is definitely stepping up. You could always say China is not doing enough. As I said, there's 10 billion tons actually every year, the emissions there. It's a huge, huge task on the table. And how do we make sure, not only just technology, I think technology is there, we'll continue to improve whatever, but really designing the policies, actually, incentives, disincentives, not only driving global acceleration, but more importantly as well, to align with the global other leading economies, actually, like EU, US, and others, to really accelerate the process towards carbon neutrality.
Thank you. Yeah, especially this carbon pricing or carbon border measures is the area where the international collaboration or coordination is must. So maybe this is a question to Ambassador Flo as well as Wu-san, that are China and Europe or European Commission starting that kind of coordination or negotiation or dialogue about carbon, let's say, border measures or carbon pricing as such between two governments?
It's not totally sort of in the sort of bilateral negotiation process yet, but it's definitely high up on the agenda. That's the maximum I'm aware of. I think it's going to be difficult conversation.
Okay.
There's going to be a lot of debate and negotiation happening, and hopefully, rather than going towards like conflicts, trade conflicts, whatever, hopefully we're going to find a neutral ground.
Ambassador Flo?
Yes, first of all, I absolutely agree with what you said earlier, namely that China will be key. If you want to achieve climate neutrality globally, then China is key. So therefore, from the EU side, of course, we are absolutely ready and very interested and engaged in working with China on the global climate agenda. Now, with regard to specific measures, let me say that at this moment, part of the Fit for 55 package is still also an internal discussion. So we are still, putting the finishing touches on our own policies. But of course, the point will come where we want to reach out to all of our partners globally in order to discuss. Because it's also very clear, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need a border adjustment mechanism. Because in an ideal world, everybody would take climate measures, and therefore, you wouldn't need to actually adjust at the border for any of this. So therefore, the idea of the carbon adjustment mechanism from the EU is also to actually incentivize everyone to do more in terms of fighting climate change, bringing down emissions, putting a price on carbon. And if everyone does that, then actually, in future, one might not need these adjustments. At the moment, however, if we see that, of course, elsewhere, some products would be produced with a high carbon footprint, meaning still contributing to further, rise in our temperatures and to climate change. That is the thing that we would then need to, of course, prevent, and where we would need to make sure that if any such products enter the EU, there would be a price on them. Let me say one other thing, and let me say that the Chinese president, of course, at the United Nations General Assembly also made a very important commitment, namely that China actually will now end export credits for unabated coal power plants globally. Very important. We need to make sure that also other countries on this planet actually now choose the right path, and it's not coal. And so therefore, very important element here.
Thank you, Ambassador Flor. That is exactly one of the questions from the audience, that how to prohibit the outdated technology sales to developing country like Africa. Well, so the coal power plant is typically the case. So I think President Xi Jinping has already committed to that. How to guarantee that kind of practice in the international setting is a very interesting question. Do you have views, Samantha or Natalie, about this issue?
Tanaka-san, I think I would just highlight, the really pressing need for international support to assist emerging and developing economies with clean energy transitions. We released a report basically on financing clean energy transitions in emerging markets and developing economies earlier this year. And it struck me that, one of the key findings was just the lack of investment currently being directed to emerging markets, and particularly given the nature of the energy demand growth that many of these markets are seeing. I think it's really important that the advanced economies and the international communities are really stepping forward to assist these countries in the transition.
There's another question for Samantha. The question is about the potential of CCUS in ASEAN countries. How do you assess it?
Actually, we also released a report on the opportunities for CCUS in Southeast Asia just in June this year. We see CCUS as being really important in this region, recognizing that there's very young infrastructure in terms of coal and also gas-fired power plants, in terms of industrial facilities, the cement, steel, chemical plants that exist in the region. Many have only been built in the last decade or so. So, and coupled with that, of course, that many of these countries in the region are major producers and exporters of fossil fuels, including coal and LNG. So I think CCUS can play an important role in terms of addressing the existing infrastructure, but also supporting the emergence of new pathways and clean energy pathways, including, low carbon hydrogen production and ammonia production. And I think, in terms of how we support deployment in these regions, again, international cooperation. I think there's some excellent examples already to point to in terms of Japan, for example, supporting a CCUS project in Indonesia that could be eligible for the JCM, the Joint Crediting Mechanism. These kind of examples I think are really important. Also having international cooperation to really build the capacity in terms of legal and regulatory frameworks for CO2 storage, supporting the investment in early projects and infrastructure. And I think the regional cooperation will also be important, given the nature of the region. Countries like Singapore, for example, have really identified that CCUS will be critical for it to reach its long-term climate goals. But it's unlikely to have domestic storage. So cooperation in the region can be important. And again, Japan has led new initiatives like the Asia CCUS network to be able to support this cooperation.
Thank you, Samantha. Natalie, do you have any view about this transfer of outdated technology like coal power?
So I have to echo everything that Samantha had to say. And also I would add that a number of countries now have instituted policies explicitly banning new fossil fuel extraction, such as Denmark and Costa Rica, and other countries can copy these policies as well. And so we could have countries in the global south adopting policies that place a moratorium on coal extraction, coal infrastructure. For example, there are some really good examples that can be learned from in this regard.
Thank you. How about the statement of Ambassador Flor, this just transition? I mean, for saving more jobs or justice or leaving nobody outside. Is there the industrial policy for the just transition?
Yeah, absolutely. This has a lot to do with retraining workers for industries which are a part of the clean energy future, a part of the low carbon future. And it's also about giving workers who are possibly of an age in which they don't want to retrain, giving them a way into early retirement as well and other things to do. But yeah, absolutely. For an example, I would point to what's been happening in Germany actually with the coal regions. It's a really good example of how you can support the workers in the communities out of a dirty industry into the low carbon future.
Okay. Tetis, could you give us your impression of the participating in this session? What have you found or useful, or do you think we need to hear your voices much more? Or what is your impression of participating in this?
Firstly, I am very happy to be here, and I have definitely learned a lot from the other speakers here, especially regarding technical topics. And they definitely are in line with what the European Youth Parliament wishes for, so that is very encouraging to hear. Moreover, as for what the youth wants, we want to be heard, we want to be trusted. And an example is the Conference on the Future of Europe in the EU, where policymakers will take into account the youth's opinions, which could be an example that could be adopted on a global scale for future policies.
Thank you. Maybe we are running out of time, so I will ask Mr. Hosen Lee to give us the summary. I mean, he is a chair of IPCC, so I really appreciate his patience of waiting for the last moment for this 1 hour and a half to sum up and his view about our discussion. Hosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is an unenviable task to summarize all these very fantastic presentations and rich discussions. Thus, I can find two common denominators from this presentation, excellent presentations and discussions. One is the key to solution for climate change is innovation and technology. Again, this is to confirm that what we have learned from all other previous examples and also previous practices and also previous findings. Fine. And second is the important role of leadership and collaboration. Leadership is the accountability, which is the trust, and you can define leadership in various scale. You can consider leadership within country. That's where the national policies for climate change comes in. Industrial policy you mentioned is clearly one of the examples of the leadership within the country. We also heard a number of countries, including EU, having a net zero goal in public domain. Now, that's one example. Now, there is a leadership across the countries. This is the relation between developed countries and developing countries. And we haven't heard much about this very critical linkage in this session. And there is a leadership across stakeholders. Youth initiative, we have a very rich discussion, presentations for youth initiatives. What's lacking is here the youth initiative from the other world, third world. And next time we should consider that aspect as well. And then we do have a youth, then we do have a leadership, the consumer groups, leadership in financial industries, but that's the agenda that we can consider next time. My reflection overall is that the climate change is a serious problem, no doubt about that. IPCC is doing its best to inform the best available science for the policymakers to take immediate action. Now, but I want to also emphasize that climate change is a symptom. It's a symptom. The cause is the way we live, the way we develop our economies. And we should not forget about that. And problem right now is a very, very serious gap existing between developed countries and developing world. world. As long as the poor remains the poor, solution for climate change will not be feasible. So I think that we noticed that inequality increased for last several decades when global greenhouse gas emissions increased tremendously. So we need to tackle that problem right to the root. We do have a rich discussion about the vision, strategy, and plan. That's fine. But what's critical at this moment is that IPCC said very clearly that we need global peaking of greenhouse gases, CO2, right now, and declining at about 7% per year throughout the next couple of decades, while economy is still growing. The reality is, as you know very well, that emissions are rebounding due to economic recovery. So we are at a very critical juncture, whether we will be in a good starting point to achieve net zero within the next 3 decades. Net zero in 3 decades is not an outcome we can expect 3 decades later. It's the outcome we can put a seed right now by achieving global peaking of CO2. Now, the way the developing country will grow will be critical. If developing countries follow the way that developed countries grew in the past for their developing economies, then any chance for achieving net zero would be over. Yes. So finance, the transfer of finance and transfer of technology from developed to developing countries, very, very critical. And I want to emphasize that aspect, so much so that we should be able to achieve global carbon net zero as soon as possible. Thank you so much for this opportunity to give a summary and my reflections on this plenary session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hosen, for a very wonderful and nice way of summarizing this session. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the participation. Especially, I thank all the panelists for their candid and very nice discussion about the very difficult issue of carbon neutrality. But we definitely I'm very, very happy to start the ICEF21 as this way. And we'll see you again very soon. Thank you very much.